So, welcome back, friends. We continue our discussion. We are trying to understand the concept of diaspora through different lenses, and there are many theoretical formations that help us understand the diaspora as a concept, as a way of life, and how diaspora is important and multifaceted. This can be understood by these different formations. um, Again, as we have seen more than once, that there are dangers of treating it as something homogeneous by way of experience of the people, because it is multifaceted in that there have been different push and pull factors dictating different diasporas, and different groups have different experiences owing to certain historical, political, and economic conditions. So, there cannot be one particular approach, or one who fits all kind of approach that might help us understand this body of knowledge. So, we have seen that the different critics have taken instances from different diasporas, somebody talking about the African diaspora, somebody talking about Jewish diaspora. The Indian diaspora itself has been treated differently based on old diaspora and new diaspora, because the very making of these different diasporas is different and calls for uh, different approaches to fully understand it. Again, there is also call for understanding it not solely in the light of, let's say, passivity or negativity, but also as dynamic ground or dynamic space for cultural exchange, which provides a very fertile ground for creativity, as we find many innovative cultural forms and art forms emerging out of it. So, in the same connection, friends, now we are going to take up two critics, Rey Chow and Avtar Brah, who have contributed significantly. Rey Chow, who comes from China, mostly talks about the Chinese diaspora, but then there is something which is of universal concern when we talk about diasporic people, and that is why many of our observations and formations also apply and substantiate our understanding of Indian diaspora. She was born in 1957. She is a prominent post colonial theorist, cultural critic, and a scholar whose work intersects with diaspora studies. And through her focus, she has broadly focused on representation, race, gender, and cultural politics, especially, as I said, in the context of Chinese diasporic identity and colonial discourse and global capitalism. So, we find that she focuses upon post structuralism, post colonialism, and cultural studies simultaneously, and explores race representation, commodification of culture, and power within colonial discourse by examining how non Western subjects, for instance, China, are represented in literature, film, and media. She is also influenced by Derrida's deconstruction and Stuart Hall's theoretical propositions. These are some of her important works. So, we are going to talk about writing diaspora tactics of intervention in contemporary cultural studies. And this particular collection of 8 essays is very, very important, as it showcases the inherent contradictions and complexities between scholarship, pedagogy, and the social and political situation, uh, especially vis a vis China and the West. So, she builds her concept of visualism on Michel Foucault's concept that visual images such as films, maps, or charts are tools of biopower, and also on Heidegger's critique that in modern culture everything becomes a picture. So, she finds that the ethnic subject has been treated as a spectacle, and he critiques how diasporic or ethnic subjects are often reduced to spectacle or cultural displays, exoticized, essentialized, and fixed in place for consumption by the West. So, ethnic identity in this sense becomes something to be seen rather than understood, a form of cultural capital packaged and performed. So, she questions the way Chinese people have been represented in the entire Western discourse, and how they have been commodified, and their images are just for display, not for understanding. So, she calls for better engagement with their culture for better understanding of these people. So, we find that her focus lies mainly on how diasporic subjects are represented in literature, film, and media, um, by Western gaze and Orientalism, by self representation and internalized colonialism, language and translation as a site of colonial control. We find that the Western gaze or Western world looks at them differently, and even to an extent that they have also internalized some of the understanding of themselves borrowed from the Western representation of them, and as such, this has not done justice even to their self image. With this, Chow also shares her observation as how society consigns women to be being visual images, reinforcing their position as other and dehumanizing them and creating an act of violence upon them. She critiques the cultural authenticity. She raises the idea that diasporic people must perform authentic cultural identity to be legitimate. She critiques both the Western multicultural frameworks that demand legible real ethnic identities and don't allow them to mix and change, and she is also critical of the national discourses from the homeland that expect diasporic loyalty or uh, purity. So, she finds that this diasporic subject has not been uh, dealt justly, either by the host society or the home society, as they both demand a certain uh, typical image of them, and allowing little to no place for any kind of cultural negotiation or new identity formation for that matter. So, she shows how authenticity becomes a trap in their case, in that they are not allowed to change or grow. The ethnic subject is caught between multiple systems of surveillance and expectation, and as such their life is impacted. She further inquires what does it mean being a Chinese in diaspora, and especially in her work The Protestant Ethnic and the Spirit of Capitalism, she engages with diasporic Chinese identities, showing how the model minority narrative in the West produces a racialized, economically productive subject, disciplined, apolitical, and useful to capitalism. So, this kind of identity formation puts pressure on the diasporic subjects, in that they are obliged to really fit in that kind of frame that has been associated with them. Uh, and this kind of model of minority myth does not liberate them, rather, it further constrains diasporic subjects by placing new forms of control under the guise of respectability or success. So, Chow mentions popular film as one of the most effective apparatuses of subject formation in our age, which needs to move post colonial studies beyond its initial phase of Orientalism critique, the elaboration of hitherto neglected forms of post coloniality. So, she believes that these forms of culture like popular films has to move forward, accommodating the post colonial subjects in a more dynamic engagement rather than treating it as something which has already been given. Chow suggests that cultural studies has very interesting alternatives to offer in terms of the study of non-Western cultures and literatures and of other kinds of media. And so, as I mentioned, The Protestant Ethnic and the Spirit of Capitalism is one of her books where she talks about how minority individuals think that by referring to themselves, they are liberating themselves from the powers that subordinate them. They may actually be allowing such powers to work in the most intimate fashion from within their hearts and souls in a kind of voluntary surrender, critiquing the stereotypical depictions with fixed inherent identity. So, she is always very critical of this kind of stereotypical representation of diaspora, and calls for opening up both on the part of the diasporic subjects and the host culture, and enter into some kind of dynamic exchange rather than sanitizing their boundaries and shutting on the possibility of any kind of exchange between them. She critiques traditional ethical idealism, which assumes that ethical values such as justice, equality, and freedom exist independently of history, power, and cultural specificity. Rather, ethics rooted in the material, historical, and political conditions of cultural difference is what is true, and that's why all these propositions need to have uh, a relook into. She frames her argument and readings deconstructively, as Headley observes, always begins by setting up an asymmetrical binary opposition between, say, comparative literature and cultural studies, or nativism and cosmopolitanism, or the past and the present. She then redefines or puts in question close reading of a strategically chosen text, a movie, popular song lyrics, occasionally an illustrative anecdote drawn from everyday life. So, for Chow, momentum stems from the sense that culture is an unfinished process, a constellation, never in pristine form, of social relations that are to be continually unworked and reworked. So, we find that she challenges this again, this sedentary notion of culture, and calls for a more dynamic view that is more inclusive of the potential that this kind of dynamic exchange has. Moving on to another very important critique, Avtar Brah. She was Ugandan British sociologist, pioneer of diasporic studies. She was born in India, Punjab, and grew up in Uganda. And these are some of her important treatises. The most important has been her cartographies of diaspora, contesting identities, that was published in 1996, and it presents a very engaging discussion on diaspora. She is a kind of pioneer feminist theorist renowned for her influential contributions to diaspora studies. And as I said, through cartographies, she has offered a nuanced understanding of diaspora, uh, emphasizing the complexities of identity, belonging, and power dynamics within transnational contexts. So, she looks at diaspora as an intersecting world and explores these intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, generation, and nationalism in different discourses, practices, and political contexts. And we find that, as Mukta comments, she provides a radical engagement with political questions faced by a black feminist intellectual surveying the landscape of post war Britain. Maps the emergence of Asian as a racialized category in post war Britain, popular and political discourse, and state practices. The discussions were based on difference and diversity in the context of feminism, anti racism, and post structuralism. She examines the concepts of diaspora, border, home, ethnicity, local, global, and multicultural, showing how ethnicity is inescapable of these processes of social relations affecting and implicating everybody. So, the most important thing that she talks about is her uh, concept of diaspora space. By diaspora space, she means a social and political arena where diverse histories of migration, displacement, and settlement intersect. And this space encompasses both migrants and non migrants, and highlighting that all individuals are implicated in the processes of diaspora formation. She asserts that the native is as much a diasporian as the diasporian is the native, emphasizing the interconnectedness of identities within shared locales. So, she talks about a dynamic exchange between the diasporic communities and the native communities, um, impacting the cultures of both. She also highlights the intersectionalities and power structures, and she says that the central thing is the recognition that diaspora experiences are shaped by intersecting axes of power, including race, gender, class, sexuality, and nationality. And so she advocates for a multi axial performative conception of power, acknowledging that individuals may simultaneously occupy positions of privilege and marginalization across different contexts. See, again, questions and challenges the fixed notions of home, which she finds essentialist and too nostalgic. And she proposes instead that home is a fluid, contested concept, and diasporic individuals negotiate multiple senses of belonging, often feeling at home in various places while also experiencing displacement. So, this perspective challenges binary distinctions between home and host countries, which we are prone to always talk about. And she also critiques the essentialist identity frameworks, in that she interrogates the limitations of identity frameworks that rely on fixed categories. She emphasizes the constructed and dynamic nature of identities shaped by historical, cultural, and political forces, and her approach encourages a move away from homogenizing narratives towards recognizing the diversity and hybridity within diasporic communities. So, You know, let us talk about her insightful comments made during her interview with Somdatta Mandal. Bara notes the flow of working class South Asians has decreased, while simultaneously there has been an increase in the arrival of those with substantial capital, students, and professional groups. The class structure has become quite differentiated, with a few South Asian billionaires as British Asians make a very significant contribution to the economy, politics, and culture. So, while talking about the cartographies of Indian diaspora, she notices a sea change in the way see the very nature of contemporary diaspora, as she finds that it comprises more and more migration of white collar job seekers, the skilled people, the well off people. And here she also highlights the meaning of the phrase contesting identities. uh, South Asian identities in Britain are heterogeneous, differentiated along such factors as class, caste, gender, sexuality, religion, linguistic group, regional group, and country of origin. But then we often find that they take it racially, and they are not able to make a difference between a Hindustani and a Pakistani, or a Sri Lankan for that matter, and they treat it as people belonging to one particular ethnic group. All these factors make for processes of fission and fusion, so that some identities overlap and others contest. So, Asian communities are faced by a whole range of socio-economic, political, and cultural problems in British society, which result in contestations, and there is no distinct identity based on nation states. Rather, the identity there is simply Asian, and this calls for a relook. She further comments with reference to her book Cartographies of Diaspora that Asians becoming the radicalized category in popular and political discourses in context to the role of gender and generation. And gender and generation remain critical axis of social differentiation. um, Further, she elaborates gender. All South Asian groups belong to a patriarchal social formations. Even Britain is characterized by patriarchal social relations, which are continually contested by feminist and other gender equality groups. Moreover, British Asians are marked by class divisions, and women are likely to be more severely affected by austerity policies than men. When it comes to generation, with a post World War II generation, it was relatively affordable to buy houses, but the housing market now is in such a crisis that the younger generation is struggling to get on to the housing ladder. In the present day structure of the gig economy, jobs for life are becoming relatively rare, and temporary employment is more of a reality. So, she talks about the different problems that the current generation of diaspora is facing, especially in Britain. When Mandal inquires about Bara's opinion on borders, as borders are present in many shapes: social borders, cultural borders, psychological and experiential, she answers back with a question: what the border does in practice. Territorial borders, mechanisms of inclusion or exclusion. There are cultural borders uh, that mean sanction or uh, prohibit marriage, caste, and class division. Therefore, borders mark power differentials, they enact power. So, to her, borders means some kind of power that regulate or control the free flow of the life of individuals. The borders make a deep psychological impact, producing all contradictory responses: love, hate, ambivalence, sense of superiority or inferiority, resistance, rebellion, collusion, intimacy, and desire for the other. So, see, further shares her views on socio psychological implications of migration, and she says that the contact with the new way simultaneously produce uh, a sense of loss and gain, or nostalgia for what is left behind, but also excitement about the promise of what the new may hold. So it's a mixed kind of bag in which you are feeling nostalgic for something that has been left behind, but are also excited at the same time for what is presented to you, or what possibilities are ahead of you. The creation of a new home demands all kinds of economic, social, cultural, and psychological resources. It depends on developing new knowledge maps to navigate the unknown, and this calls for reshaping of your sensibilities. The taken for granted customs, traditions, and cultural practices from the country of origin may be called into question by the lifestyles and values of the receiving society, and some cultural practices may clash, but others may complement and be amenable to reworking and renewal. So the diasporic subject inhabit unique world. They are born in one setup with one set of cultural values, migrate to other setup where the cultural values are different, and some of the cultural values come uh, directly to class with whatever they have learned, and some of them complement what they have already learned. So they need to break the shackles of their what may be called the cultural conservatism in order to break into this new culture, and by that they can really look at their own self, can change and adapt to the host culture to the extent possible or required, and that is what will make their living possible in this host land. Unless and until you have this kind of a feeling, probably the quality of life will certainly be very poor, as you will always be fractured from within, and that will not help you in any way. So, the trauma of the circumstances of living will warrant psychological support of a specific kind, and only those people will survive who are resilient and adaptable. Barah quotes, and I quote, "I was treated as different, perhaps orientalized, though I have not experienced the naked racism encountered by black and indigenous people, as I was protected by my status as a foreign student." But nonetheless, she thinks that different people have different experiences, and many people have not been as privileged as she has been. So there is an emotional cost to such migration, and these experiences leave indelible marks on the psyche of the people who cross borders. She points out hierarchy is attuned to exploring the asymmetries of power from a perspective simultaneously from above and below. One could see how Asians were likely to treat Africans as inferior, even as we ourselves were interiorized by the Europeans. So, this is again very interesting how one particular diasporic group treats the other diasporic group as inferior. The psychological impact of the working of these social hierarchies feeds into the everyday configuration of social relations, the everyday encounters between people, and we always find this reflects in the way they connect and interact with each other. So Barah mentions diasporas are not the same as casual travel, they are settled populations. So any casual travel may not be treated as diaspora, where you go there for a short period of time and come back. Probably you don't realize the everyday struggles of a population that has been there for a longer period of time. So, when we talk about diaspora, we are talking about those settled populations who have been living there for a bigger period of time and are exposed to all the vulnerabilities and conflicts and struggles that a diasporic community faces. She elaborates upon further, home is a mythic place of desire in the diasporic imagination, by saying diasporic imagination serves as a filter for constructing modalities of home. How does a house, whether in the sense of a building or a country, become home? This involves material as well as emotional, affective, and psychic processes. Feelings of home resonate with the here and now as well as with mythic connections of desire. So, again, she questions this feeling of home being a fixed entity or a fixed notion, believing that this is something which comes out when we psychologically feel attached, emotionally feel belonging to a particular place, we might call it home. But then this is again a psychological process, and if psychologically we are able to settle in a new place, probably we can call it home. Uh, but again, we have seen the earlier critics have also critiqued our ideas of a fixed notion of home, believing that the diasporic subjects don't necessarily belong to a physical location, although there is always a strong desire to go back to their place of origin, which they call home. But then this notion of home is something that is imaginary, more a mental thing than a physical entity. So, friends, this is all in this class, and I hope we have been further able to understand uh, how to treat the diasporic subject and the experiences of diaspora. And I believe this will help us when we go further with our discussions. These are the references, you can refer to them, and this is all for now. We'll again uh, take this discussion further in the next class. Thank you very much.